Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is a panel called Making Sense of Hmong Americans' Responses to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, a conversation among Hmong American professors. And I would like to thank Yang Lower for getting us all started on this conversation and organizing us together as a panel. And I feel really privileged to be in conversation with my good friends and colleagues today. We got together and decided that we wanted to do this panel to have this conversation about Hmong American responses to, the police killings, state-sanctioned killings, and anti-Blackness that is happening right now, that has been happening, since 1610, when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the U.S., or what was then the colonies of the U.S. And so we wanted to have a conversation, especially because one of the officers who was involved in George Floyd's murder is Hmong American, and we are all concerned about social justice, racial justice, the importance of Black Lives Matter, seeing solidarity. But in this particular moment, it has hit us as professors, scholars, and our communities quite hard because of the ways that Hmong Americans are implicated in both his murder, the Hmong American community's responses after his murder, and the uprisings that have also impacted Hmong American communities in the Twin Cities. So part of our message that we wanted to, some of the messages that we wanted to sort of talk about today is to have an open mind and to create open-mindedness and interconnections. We want to be able to do more than just empathize. And we want to talk about how we can be anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist, right? What does that mean? And to push against whiteness from Hmong Americans. So our goals for this panel and some of the questions that we're trying to ask are, how do we link Hmong struggles and liberation to those of Black and other communities of color? 2, how do we talk about racial justice and Black Lives Matter in the classroom and then with our families and friends, right? 3, what are the things that we can do within and beyond electoral politics? So how can we help dismantle anti-Blackness and investments in whiteness in Hmong communities and in broader US society? And then finally, we hope that as part of our conversation today, we are also creating a Hmong Studies reading list that will accompany this session. And it's going to be an ongoing list, but really to sort of think about how do we become more informed on the issues and have a critical perspective, right? Especially for our young Hmong Americans. And I would say that this panel is, the target audience for this panel is for Hmong Americans, because Hmong Americans have been really involved in this conversation and in lots of different ways, right? So how do we bring all this together and think through the issues that we have at hand? So with that, we're going to do self-introductions. So we will start with Val.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm an assistant professor at Sacramento State in Ethnic Studies, Department of Ethnic Studies. My specialization and work is particularly on these categories of race, racism, racialization, and more the larger questions of how does what's happening, for instance, right now, being impacted and informed by systems of power. So I think that's one that I really want to maybe address more in this conversation. I teach classes on Asian American studies generally in the department, but I always try to link these connections to other groups, right? And that's maybe one thing I hope we can talk about is how is this not really an isolated event of just Hmong Asian Americans, but how do we play a very significant, intricate part of what's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yang Lor, and I am an assistant teaching professor at UC-Merced in the Department of Sociology. My research revolves around Hmong Americans, political participation, education, and inequality. I also teach courses about race and ethnicity as well. And like many of my colleagues here, I've been very interested in the Hmong American response and trying to make sense, trying to process it, but also at the same time, find that it's necessary for us as educators to help provide some context so that Hmong people can interpret these struggle, these movement in a way to bring about more solidarity with the Black Lives Movement.
Kong.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Kong Pa, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire in women's gender and sexuality studies, as well as critical Hmong studies. I teach classes on these exact issues that we will be talking about today, on Hmong history as well as contemporary issues. And I also teach courses in LGBTQ activism, as well as feminists and racial justice social movements in the United States. So these are certainly issues that I really want to bring out in the conversation today. And I am really thankful that we are able to gather today to really provide information for our community and provide perspectives.
And my name is Vang, and I'm an assistant professor at UC-Merced in the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies program. And I teach courses in, critical race theory and power, critical refugee studies, and US empire. And my research is at the intersection of ethnic studies and critical refugee studies. And I do work on Hmong, refugees more broadly and thinking about history and memory. So I'm really excited to be a part of and privileged to be a part of this conversation. For me, since George Floyd, it has been really, really hard for me to sort of think through what my, what my role is, right? And then how do I contribute to, this broader sort of anti-racist, anti-Black movement. And I'm really glad to put my energy forth in having this conversation with, other Hmong American scholars and having conversation with Hmong communities, because I think that that's an important role that I can play.
Hi, everyone. My name is Xiong. For identification purposes only, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I teach courses in Hmong American social movements. I teach a course on Hmong American experiences. I also teach a course on immigration and immigrants and refugees, and another course on race and ethnicity. My research has been largely on trying to understand what immigrants and refugees make happen politically in their host societies, specifically the US. So tonight, this afternoon, I'm very privileged and to be engaging with my good colleagues and friends here on this very important, very timely, but also very critical and sensitive topic around Black Lives Matter, around Hmong's response. And so I'm looking forward to sharing some insights and perspectives on, especially the latter part, Hmong Americans' responses to the events following the police brutality and murder of George Floyd.
So maybe we should just start out by giving a little bit of some information on the series of events that took place that really spurred this national conversation. Of course, has been a long time coming, but this particular event really intensified a lot of the conversations. So perhaps let's start there. What is the chronology of the events? What happened? Perhaps a few of you could provide a larger history on Black Lives Matter and the series of events that led up to it, and the different events that led up to the current uprisings that we are now facing. So let's start there.
Does somebody want to start? I don't have the dates, so I don't want to. Yeah.
Pheng, do you wanna talk about the event and then the sort of uprisings in Minneapolis, and then I can jump in and talk about how it's not new, and then put it into historical context.
Yeah. So essentially, what happened was on the weekend of Memorial Day, we know that George Floyd, who is a Black man, was at a grocery store where reports were stating that he attempted to use a fake dollar bill or $20 bill to purchase some items, and ultimately what happened was police were called, and the subsequent events were captured on video where he was later detained by 4 police officers. But the majority of the video clip that the nation saw depicted where Officer Derek Chauvin, I believe that's how you say his last name, was holding George Floyd on the ground with his knee on his neck. And there were, of course, many onlookers who saw the event and ultimately recorded it on video. On the video clip, there was also a Hmong American police officer named Tu Tao who was holding onlookers back and preventing anyone from helping Floyd, although a lot of people were begging him to intervene, and ultimately he did not intervene. And so with Floyd's detention and all of the other 3 police officers holding him down with Chauvin's knee on his neck, he later died from this event. So essentially he was murdered in plain sight, on camera, in broad daylight. And this led to a series of uprisings. Immediately, activists and protesters immediately began uprising and demanding answers for why this even happened in the first place, and especially the cruelty of this event, being that it was captured on camera with essentially no care for Floyd's life. So this led to a series of uprisings where over the next couple of days in the Memorial Day weekend, buildings were ransacked, of course, right? Demonstrations were held and thousands of people came out to protest all over the United States, not just in Minneapolis. And I actually live in Minneapolis as well, so this hits particularly close home, seeing a lot of the demonstrations and a lot of the buildings that were ransacked, and people were angry. So this really eventually led to a huge movement all over the nation.
I wonder if we can go back to right after George Floyd was killed. I want to insert in that before the uprising, before the protest, not much was being done about the police officers. And that's important here. And the protests were in response, at least in large part, to that non-response, not doing much about what just happened to Mr. Floyd.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep.
Well, Yang Sao, do you want to say a little bit more? I mean, I think that could just be your.
And so I think part of our conversation tonight that I'm hoping we could engage on is this long-standing issue of police brutality, much longer pandemic of racism in the US. And I'd love to hear insights and perspectives on that too from anybody. But we're talking not simply about Mr. Floyd and the current movement, but we're going to also, I hope, provide some historical context for understanding these very long-standing issues. Ma, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, the uprisings in the aftermath of Floyd's murder and the lack of response, I would say, from, you know, the Minneapolis police, right, in terms of investigating his murder and even perhaps arresting the police officers. Those responses, the uprisings, are not new, right? And so, you know, our conversation, as Yang Sao said, is not to sort of exceptionalize this event and to say that this is now we care about it and now, you know, you should care about it, but that to also help us situate, you know, Floyd's murder and what the system that supports and sanctions his murder in the larger context of the history of the US as a racist state, right? And one that is built on the enslavement of African peoples and then also the conquest and dispossession of the native indigenous peoples of the Americas. And so that longer history is why we want to have this conversation and why it's important for us to have this conversation so that we don't decontextualize and say this is a, you know, a sort of a one, you know, exceptional event in the sense of, you know, these are just bad officers, right? Because we have seen, even after Floyd, right, more police killings. And right before Floyd, with Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, who were two other African Americans murdered, right? Breonna Taylor, who was murdered while she was sleeping, with police storming into her home with a search warrant that was, you know, not her, right? Not for her, and shooting and killing her. And then Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed not by police officers, but by two white supremacists who were, you know, doing civilian policing, right? And so, you know, so part of this is to think about, well, what does it mean that it's not just another Black person who is being killed by the police, right? But there had been a long history of numerous Black people who have been killed by the police. And the underlying logics of this are the sort of the ongoing dehumanization of Black people, right? The state-sanctioned violence and anti-Blackness that is situated within the system of racism and white supremacy that was built on slavery, right? And built on conquest. And so, you know, the bringing over of Africans, the African slave trade, and, you know, Africans being enslaved in the US, and this 400, it's a 400-year history, right? From the beginning of the African slave trade or Africans landing in sort of, the US colonies at that time, to now. It's a long, long history, right? And it's a long history of ongoing murder. We saw this, during slavery, where, African-American bodies were used as slave labor, right? In terms of the fields, working out in the fields of cotton, sugar, and various industries. And then African-American women's labor, both as, field labor, but also reproductive labor, right? Because African-American women were raped, were and responsible and made to reproduce more enslaved Africans, right? For the South and for the slavery system. And so this is a really long history, and even after the abolishment of slavery, right, that the system of Jim Crow racism came into being, right, where enslaved Africans were free, yet continued to work in a sort of sharecropping structure, and then continued to be, their bodies continue to be regulated, right, by former white slave owners, and then the sort of, white supremacist society. And so then this led to lynchings, right? Lynchings, particularly of Black men, and part of the lynchings is the fear of Black men raping white women, right? It's this sort of heteropatriarchal protection of white womanhood. And so this is, again, then a long history of violence that started with slavery, continued even after slavery, and then through the civil rights movement, right? And then to sort of what we have as our current structure. So it's, this is a long history, again, of 400 years of racial injustice, right? 400 years of state-sanctioned violence. And a lot of scholars and folks have, said over and over again that policing is an institution that maintains the system of racism, right? The structure of racism. So policing is not an institution that, helps and protects people, especially Black people, and especially, Latinx people, or, Southeast Asian, Asian Americans, right? And indigenous peoples. Policing has been an institution that has been used to regulate the bodies of Black and other people of color, right? And the gun, right, has been used to enforce slavery, used to enforce conquest and dispossession, right? So these are all things, that tools and weapons and institutions that are ongoing and are used to maintain the system. So police, we also have, I think that's a key point is, how do we rethink our relationship to the police as Hmong Americans, right? That police is not here to protect us.
And I think it's so important to,
go ahead, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's important to contextualize, the Black experience in this country, because too often, I think many Americans think that racism ended with the civil rights movement. But keep in mind, the civil rights movement only made it illegal for you to discriminate on the basis of race, okay? You can't explicitly say, I'm treating this person this particular way because he or she is Black or Asian or Hispanic, okay? But racism has not ended, it's merely changed form. For the Black experience, we currently live in a system that's known as mass incarceration, where we disproportionately lock up a huge percentage of African Americans. And so today, the justification for the treatment of African American is through this system where we lock so many of them up that any encounter with police officer, African American men are likely to have a criminal record because of the system of mass incarceration. And so nowadays, what you see on TV, the dehumanization, the senseless killing of African Americans. If you think about it, the first thing people often think about is that person deserved it. That victim of police brutality deserved it because he has a criminal record. Okay, and so that's how what Black Lives Matter is really about. The fact that people, African American in today's age and society are subjected to this system of oppression, which then gives those in power a race-neutral reason for dehumanizing Black bodies. So they point to, though, this person has a criminal record, therefore what the police did was somehow justifiable. And so we have to kind of recognize how all these history, come to fruition and how African Americans are perceived and labeled, and how they're thought about after they've been victimized by the criminal justice system in our society.
Earlier, I was just going to say, I wonder if you all wanted to say more about the system of white supremacy in the society, and because this term is sometimes used in academia, but it may or may not be used by the public, and so, but it's an important key to understanding the issues that we're talking about. I'm wondering if any of you would like to add or elaborate on what that means, in whichever way that makes sense to you, what the system of white supremacy is in this society.
Yeah, I think when we think about white supremacy, we often associate with the KKK. Okay, that's how we traditionally think about it. People are the whites who are explicitly racist. But white supremacy is essentially a system in which whites occupy positions of power in this country. So if you look at political power, most of those in positions of political power are whites. If you look at economic power, the same thing is happening here. So white supremacy, one way to think about it is who has the power to set up society in a way that benefits certain groups over others. In addition to just positions of power, the way we think about society, how we think about Black Lives Matter or the ongoing protests, these are a reflection of the perspectives of whites. So white supremacy is about power, but it's also about what we think as normal, okay? What we think as normal, what we think as competence, because these measures are actually, they're not explicitly white, but implicitly they reflect the norms of white Americans in this country. So that's how I think about white supremacy in a way that kind of gets away from just the KKK, but how we can perpetuate white supremacy by privileging certain norms or standards over other. For instance, we think about riots, we see it as, this is a destruction of property because we're watching news, we're watching commentators talk about these issues from a white dominated perspective.
Yeah, and I also want to add that it's also based on the way that whiteness is valued, right? Whiteness as both an identity category, but also a legal category, and how whiteness, even though it's unspoken, right? That it has huge capital power, legal power, and a lot of the laws that have been, the Constitution is based on protecting whiteness, right? And valuing whiteness as a legal category. So legal scholar Cheryl Harris has talked about whiteness as legal and as property. Why is it legal? Because it's seen as property and seen as valuable property to be protected, right? So that in relation to that, Blackness during the system of slavery was also considered property, right? Chattel slavery. But that property only had one particular value, and that was the labor of the bodies of Black folks, right? And so Blackness was devalued in that way. So that relationship has structured the way that the US, is built, right? The founding fathers, quote unquote, and the way that the Constitution and henceforth the legal system has been structured upon that relationship, right? And so, when we think about and this is, comes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who talks about, is questioning the law and whether or not it's just, right? And so, this is why, piggyback on Yang, that it is built on white perspective, but then to protect whiteness, and that the law is already unjust, right? And so that valuing system continues to operate in this way, so that Black lives continue to be dehumanized and devalued, right? And so Black Lives Matter as a movement is to revalue Black lives, not necessarily to add value because it didn't have value, right? But to say that it has always had value, right? And to call for justice for the ongoing devaluation and dehumanization of Black lives.
Thanks, Bao. You'd like to add anything to that?
So we're kind of skipping around, right? The questions. I guess I want to talk about this later, but I can bring it up here. I guess to address your question, white supremacy. If we play off the mainstream rhetoric that was used to, I think, suppress civil rights efforts and the movement, people think of this moment as post-racial, right? And I think the election of Trump has sort of reignited more of a white nationalist, perspective of this country. But I think many people still live in this very colorblind vision or view of how race and race relations operate in this country. And so I think what's important for us to understand about these conversations, I think you're starting to bring these up in your talks so far, is that we can't talk about this movement as an isolated experience of just Blacks, right? And this is why it's important to think of white supremacy as a system of power that upholds that power, as you say, Yang, to be occupied by rich white men, right? And inherited through their generations. But this happens at the expense of suppressing and devaluing Black lives, right? And I think the movement is largely, I think, to me, an effort to address that, right? The historical and contemporary ways in which Black lives continue to be devalued, to allow those privileges and advantages for whites. And then the other question I have to ask, because this is part of why we're bringing this issue up, right, is how the other groups are positioned and hold certain positions in this racial hierarchy to allow these two relationships to happen, right? Because race is always thought of as black and white, or between Blacks and whites. But it's interesting because when Asian Americans get brought into this conversation, we're sort of like on the outskirts, but when we're involved directly, like in the officer shooting, because this reminds me also of Peter Lang, right? In which it also, I think, divided the Asian American community in terms of how they responded to that. So to me, it's just, again, brings up the same issues about what is contemporary race relations, and how this continues to happen because of the system of white supremacy, rooted in colonialism and white supremacy. So we can't disregard that. These do not happen in vacuums and isolated events, right? Black Lives Matter is something that, as an Asian American, as Hmong Americans, we should care about, because our positioning in society allows that to happen, right? Being Asian American, we're used as both the pawn of the model minority, but at the same time, the threat of the yellow peril, so that we don't always reach up to par with whites. So I think that's really important to be in this conversation, right? And I've been reading a lot of articles about, you know, the shooting and the officer being, not the shooting, so the killing and the officer being Hmong. And there's a very recurrent theme that bothers me, right? And one is the big article that's written by the New York Times that covered this recently. And it always seems to, and this reminds me of Vang, right? Vang, sorry, when he was, you know, under a microscope for the killings of the white hunters in the Midwest. When it's about a community that the mainstream doesn't understand, or like Asian Americans, we don't fit in that racial positioning of being black and white, we always get put under a microscope. We're always being asked to be accountable for and to speak for our community, right? So what happens in this instance for us to be careful of is that it takes away from the scrutiny of the system of racism, right, and white supremacy, and puts the blame and the focus on the community to explain and somehow come up with the answer for why this is happening. Right. So no matter if he was Asian, Hmong, or whatever, it seems that when it's a person of color in this instance, which was a cop, right, the microscope and scrutiny gets put onto the community, right? So for us to be wary of that, because the danger of that is then it allows the system to excuse and neutralize this conversation, right, that we should be focused on. Why does the system over and over again continue to fail us as citizens that it's supposed to so-called protect, right? And this system is upheld to keep these positions of power and these relationships intact. So I think these conversations need to happen in a way that makes these connections, right? And I think we ask these questions in isolation, vacuum. We tend to risk that danger of putting our communities under a microscope unnecessarily, right? And that is what bothers me, is that when you read these mainstream news outlets, the first thing they do is explain who Hmong people are, how we got here, why we exist, right? And it's like 40 years later, we still don't exist in the history books, right? Which is fundamental to why ethnic studies should be central in education. But these conversations to me sounds like the white mainstream, the white system does not want to have these conversations, right? Because that puts them under the microscope, puts them under scrutiny to ask the questions that should challenge the system. So I just want us to be wary of that, both the scholars and both as citizens of this country, to not feel that we should be the ones to answer to those that put our communities under scrutiny, correct? That we should redirect the question, reframe these issues as to why the system keeps failing us, right? And that why is it that when one of our communities involved, we get asked to be accountable for those actions?
No, I mean, I think you hit on so many important points there, right? And I think that's why this discussion, this conversation we're having is so important, and we're reframing it as a conversation, right? Because, you know, when George Floyd, right after, you know, he was murdered and the news came out, and, you know, we learned who all the officers were involved, there was a lot of feelings of guilt and shame and pain, right, and rage at the injustice of it all. And then there was tremendous pressure to respond, right, and to have a sense of, you know, what is the right response, what, you know, in this moment, right? And so part of this conversation, you're right, that we're not trying to have a right, I mean, in that way, right, response, but to have a conversation that redirects the questions, and a conversation with and for Hmong communities, right, not for the New York Times to be publishing, so that we can have these difficult conversations to contextualize what's going on, and understand our place and our role in the sort of positioning and relationships of racial formation, right? that happens in the US, but actually doesn't start in the US, right? So that for Hmong Americans and Hmong refugees, you know, the introduction into the US structure of racism happens in Laos, right? And when the US came and recruited Hmong as proxy soldiers, right? And so, you know, these ideas circulate globally, racial ideas circulate globally, and it already situates and pits different groups together, I mean, against each other, right? So that our solidarities are precarious because these solidarities, we had to build these solidarities under and within the structure of white supremacy. And yet they can be just, you know, sort of taken apart at any time, right? When something like this happens. And so it is hard. And I think that you brought up really good points for us to talk about.
So maybe we should move on to our next topic of discussion. But the contextualization that you all provided were extremely helpful, especially to talk about the long history of dehumanization of Black bodies and Black people, and the continuation of slavery and its current manifestations in mass incarceration, as well as explaining white supremacy and the ways that Asian Americans are positioned. So all of that has been tremendously helpful, and let's see where we could apply that to the next topic.
That sounds good. That sounds good. I think that's a good point of transition. And I think to some extent, we've started to bring this, some of these ideas in already. And that is, I think of two questions when I think about this next section. And that is, what are some ways that Hmong have been, let's just say, exposed to the system of white supremacy prior to their arrival? Or if we don't want to use the word exposed, in what ways have they been entangled into the system even way before they arrive? The second question I'd like to pose for our discussion is, what are some atrocities or histories, traumas that Hmong have experienced relating to their being in Laos, or becoming refugees, or becoming new arrivals in the US? So perhaps we can start with the first, and that is, prior to Hmong's arrival, in what ways have they been entangled with or exposed to white ideas or practices, or even the system?
I mean, I guess I'll continue with that question from my the early point that I made, but to think about, and you know, this brings in Bao's point about, or question about, you know, what is race and what is racial formation, right? And so, and how does it you know, that it imbricates everyone, right? Even though people may think that they're not racist, right? Or people may think that they don't participate in the system and it doesn't impact them, right? So I think that for me, you know, in terms of my training and thinking about race and racial formation, and we think that US is the most racist state, right? And I mean, it is true, right? And yet, you know, how did those ideas come about? You know, how does the US become the way that it is, right? And where is the place of Asian Americans and Hmong Americans in particular that we're concerned about? And so the racial formation is not just something that happened in the US, right? When you know, immigrants come and then, you know, encounter white folks and Black folks and indigenous folks, right? But that racial formation is a structure that happens globally, right? And globally means that the ways in which people, certain, the other of Europe, right, are seen to occupy these other spaces and places in the globe that can be colonized, right? Or that can be, that its resources, the resources of these places can be extracted for capital gain, right? For the colonizer or for the imperial power. And so in this case, how Hmong, in Laos came to be embroiled is, one, French colonialism, right, in former Indochina since the late 1800s. And yet, both Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and Hmong living in Laos, Vietnam, right, Thailand, in those various states or territories at that time, and having a really complicated relationship with the Lao state and the Lao government that was in formation, right? I guess with the Lao monarchy, but then also having another complicated relationship with the French, right? So Hmong have found themselves trying to negotiate these different relationships with both the state and imperial powers, right? And so at the end of World War II, and the French, leaving, and the declaration of independence of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam from French colonialism, and then US occupation, right? And so we think of that as, a kind of clean break. The colonizer left, and now the US is coming in, and it's a benevolent, power, perhaps, right? But the reality of it was that there was no clean break, right? So it became the US sort of occupation, we might as well just call that, of Laos in particular, that a lot of Hmong Americans, where a lot of Hmong Americans can trace our heritage back to, is that it was a continuation of colonialism, right? In a militarized way. During French occupation, Hmong were recruited as porters for the French, right? Messengers, and also soldiers. But during the US occupation and war, that Hmong were then recruited to be US proxy soldiers, right? Because in the US national and government imagination, Laos was not a place that wanted to send its soldiers, right? And it was because it was not a place that they thought that they would be able to extract whatever natural resources, right? That it wasn't a place to build an empire, right? And this is also, that Hmong are also racialized in relation to Lao people in this way, right? That Lao people and the country of Laos just was not a territory that was worth it for the U.S., but that it was important for the U.S. to still take a stand in Laos, right? And in order to take a stand in Laos, I had to recruit Hmong, Lao, Mien, Khmer, and other ethnic groups to be proxy soldiers for the U.S., right? And so, it is well known. Anyone can read as Bao said, any newspaper article, and this is rehashed over and over again, like this story, right? But that we become sort of almost desensitized to it, both as a Hmong American community, especially Hmong Americans growing up in the US, but then also like the broader, non-Hmong community, that, oh, this is the story. But, the reality is that Hmong sacrificed so much for the US, right? And so after the war, and US defeat, and the US withdrawal, and the CIA withdrawing its support of Hmong, especially General Vang and his, army, that then they had to Hmong were left to, decide what they were gonna do. Do they stay and become persecuted and, get forced to go into re-education camps? Or do they flee, which, people did all those things, right? And then also encounter death and violence on the flight on the way to the Mekong River, drowning as they crossed the Mekong River, and then if they made it to the refugee camps, encountering ongoing regulations and restrictions in the refugee camps, right? And so, what I said earlier about how Hmong were not racialized only when they arrived in the US, right? But that this is a broader sort of racial, militarized, imperialist project that that already racialized Hmong as expendable people who could just act as proxy soldiers, whose lives, if lost, will be fine, right? There's a statue in Fresno that the Hmong community had built to commemorate the history that 10 Hmong people or Hmong soldiers at a time were sent out to rescue or recover the body of a downed white American pilot, right? One of the pilots who flew the bombing missions in Laos. And so for them, their lives, it was a reality that their lives were expendable, that they weren't rescuing someone who was alive, that they were actually maybe just recovering the body of a dead white pilot, right? White American pilot. And so Hmong refugees and Hmong veterans know this, right? And they know the injustices that they experienced and what that means and why they push and why the strategy and the rhetoric to push for, veterans recognition, right? Or some sort of benefits, burial benefits at least, right? If they can't have sort of veterans benefits. So, but then once Hmong refugees arrived in the US, then, there's also the sort of very present structure of white supremacy, right? And I was listening to a panel organized by Tujer that Gajo was on and Bao was on. Thinking about, it's an incomplete history when refugees, Hmong refugees in particular, come to the US and encounter the US education system that teach incomplete histories about, the structure of slavery and then also what happened in Southeast Asia. So then we don't know, right? And we only know what we're told. We only learn what we are given, and we're told to forget the histories that we already know, right? That don't match up with this master narrative, and then it produces interracial, interethnic conflict, right?
Could we go back a little bit to the, prior to their arrival? So Hmong society has never been a monolith. It's never been a single Hmong society, but there are factions and segments within Hmong society, including segments that were strongly against French colonial powers, and segments later on during the Secret War that were strongly against the US and Americans in general.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to kind of pose a slightly different question and kind of challenge us to think through. So let me just say this. Can we think of ways in which some Hmong at least, arrive with prejudice, whitewash views? Did some Hmong in general, not by their own fault, but because, this current issue has been one of the most divisive issues ever in Hmong American society, and it remains very divisive. And part of that may have something to do with our pre-migration experiences, having been exposed, entangled, embroidered with white ideas and racist ideas. So could it be that even prior to our arrival here, we were taught perhaps racist views? or at least some Hmong were?
I'm not too sure if this truly gets at that question, but to go back to the New York Times article that Bao was alluding to earlier, which I also absolutely hated and really was disturbed by it, that the quote from the article talked about how there were these Hmong police officers who felt sympathy for Tu Tao, the Hmong American police officer who was also involved in the murder of George Floyd. And Hmong are conflicted because there are these Hmong American officers who sympathize with them. And the quote talked about how becoming a police officer was a natural sort of occupation, right, for these individuals, because coming from the war and being soldiers and their fathers and grandfathers being exposed to militarism, right, to war and to guns and all of that stuff, that becoming a police officer for these individuals was quote unquote natural, right? And so for me, I really see that as a continuation of, right, the racist and sort of white supremacist logics around militarism that seduces Hmong people, right, to become entangled and continue the violence and the cycle of violence that started with the imperial sort of excursions that the US state was engaging in the 1960s. So to me, that really struck me, right? That these ideas around militarism are ingrained in Hmong, and then of course this person just naturally sees themselves as becoming a police officer and to again be involved, right, in the police security state, right, upon arrival. So when you were asking that question, and Ying Sao, it made me think of that, right, that in some ways, this particular person, is already ingrained with these ideas, right, about what it means to become a good refugee, right, what it means to become a good migrant, right, that for refugees, we are essentially given this freedom to come to the US, and the US nation state is saving us. And so therefore, becoming a police officer is one of the most noble things that one can do in repaying the state. So in a sense, we are getting these messages implicitly, really, right, to continue, right? I would say the cycle of violence and the ways in which we keep embedding ourselves, right, in the very structures of the police security state, when in reality, I would say that there's so much more opportunities for us to detach ourselves from the state. But this is a way that we are seduced, right, to become engaged in it, right, in the belly, right, of the structure.
Yeah, I mean, Kong, you also have a note on here about like the gangster, the figure of the Hmong gangster or gang member, right? And so this idea of the Hmong soldier who fought in Laos for the US as a kind of warrior, like a noble warrior, right, who sacrificed for the cause of the US imperialist state. And yet, yeah, and that, as you said, that turns into then, yeah, it's natural that they should be then predisposed to be police officers or to take up these kind of roles in US society, right? And then the flip side of that is also the idea of the Hmong gang member, which is also, in the sort of 80s and 90s in Hmong communities, and in places where a lot of Hmong communities or Southeast Asian communities live, that it was a big issue, right? Not in terms of Hmong gang, you know, it was a big issue in the sense that a whole generation of Hmong men were lost to the incarceration system, right? But that the idea of the Hmong gang member is also part of this noble warrior concept, right? That they are on the one hand predisposed to then become the police, but then also predisposed to become the gang member. And what ties those two together is violence, right? That they just embody violence. They're just violent, right? And so, and this comes through in the Clint Eastwood's film Gran Torino, that was released in 2008, right? And you know, I think as Hmong Americans, I'll talk about it because it's an easily accessible film, right? But the way in which Hmong gang members were talked about and were portrayed in the film, and Eastwood's character rescuing the good refugee family in particular, you know, sort of this you know, the good Hmong American boy and his sister from the bad gang members, right? It's all part of this sort of narrative that comes from you know, the U.S. secret war in Laos, and then I think, you know, as a short aside too, that thinking about anti-Blackness, like that is also a global project, right? That, you know, it's something that people just don't pick up on when they get to the U.S., but it is a global thing, in the way that the imperialism has worked out, right? And conquest has worked.
I wonder if we could reflect also on what Hmong has, again, recognizing that the Hmong community has never been a monolith. What are some of the lessons Hmong have learned from their experiences with trauma? I mean, have they learned anything about respect, humanization, equality? What do Hmong care about? I pose this question so that we can start to think about how our Hmong refugees / Hmong American experiences are very much linked with many other minority, especially including Blacks' experiences. So again, in what ways can you think about Hmong experiences? In what ways do we value equality, respect, dignity, humanization? Feel free to chime in and say anything that that makes sense to you.
Well, I think going back to the point of the racialization of Hmong, right? That in fact, we are racialized to be quite similar to the ways in which Black men are racialized, with this idea that we are gangsters, or that we are just naturally inclined, right, towards violence. And that's one of the justifications for the killing of Black men, right? That one of the excuses that we hear over and over again are that police officers fear for their lives, right? And so then therefore it's justified in killing Black men. And we have a case of Pheng, right, among American teenager, right, in my neighborhood, North Minneapolis, who was also chased down and murdered by a white police officer. And the justification, again, was that Pheng had a gun, and essentially, right, that he feared for his life. And so I think that
in that case, was there also allegation that he may have been a gang member?
Yes, right. There were allegations that he was part of a gang, and that police officers even scouted him and his group of friends in the first place, was that they were doing suspicious activities at the street corner, right? Like how gang members would do, passing around drugs or doing dealings and whatnot. So that was also one of the allegations. That's why he was even pursued in the first place. So of course, after that, there were a lot of uprisings and protests and demonstrations where Hmong people really understood that we are part of the racial caste system in this country where our lives don't matter, right, to the police state. And the Hmong really, I mean, I've attended some of these demonstrations back in 2007 and 8. And we also held, vigil concerts for Pheng Li and other victims of police murders that I also attended, where speakers, and these are Hmong American speakers who came out, right, to articulate and make speeches and demand justice. And they really recognize that we are racialized in ways that are very dehumanizing. And so then these ideologies, right, that are really born out of racism and white supremacy justifies our own killings. And so I think there are clear links, right? And it is a bit frustrating, to be quite honest, that these links are not as clear to others, but at least to me in my head, it's very evident. And so Hmong Americans really also have long recognized this. And there are stories that we hear from our elders and parents of racist attacks on them as they arrived, right, in the United States in the 1970s and early 1980s. And so I think Hmong have long understood, right, their own racialization and their place in the American racial caste system. And many have also taken opportunities to create solidarities, right, with other communities of color who are similarly situated in the racial landscape, right? So I think we have many people who really understand this, right? So I think going back to the New York Times, one of my anger that comes from that is that Hmong are seen as, we're caught up, right, in this racial war, right, in the United States, and that we're passively swept up in it. But I don't think that's the case, right? That we really are intimately tied to it, and we know that. Hmong people have long recognized that. And we're not just these passive refugees who are swept up in in these revolutions, but that we really have been part of it, and many people have long recognized that.
Yang or
I
Bao?
think you should, I was going to say Bao should, based on her work too.
Are we moving on?
You want to talk about your research on the criminalization of Hmong boys, Bao? I think it's really relevant to this conversation we're having about how Hmong Americans have been racialized and also put in particular ways as well.
Okay, yeah, I was paying attention to Kong's description of the Pheng Li case. Yeah, and I think that we kind of sit in this really strange position, right? As Hmong in the U.S., we have a very unique connection to the U.S. because of these historical ties, before we came here, but also as we settle and become Americanized, so-called assimilated, we get racialized, right, as either the good American or the bad American, right? And so I think what's important to think about is that, yes, we have this background where we are sort of playing into that refugee story, right? And the US loves to create these stories to make sense of people who are very different. I think that's what the New York Times does, right? And so putting those conversations in that way, again, like I said, neutralizes that race conversation, right? Neutralizes and dismisses a conversation on systemic racism that it's forced to address. And so even that the conversation, the argument in the article, the New York Times article, tries to make us seem like we were the Korean immigrants during the LA riots, right? We're in this midst of this race war, race riot between Black and white. Again, so we're being used again to be that wedge between Black-white conflict, right? And so what's interesting is that it sits at these very complicated layers, right, of what it means to be Hmong in the US, because we are not Black and white. We're Asian American, but then we have an experience as refugees, right? And so the thing that I do talk about in my work is that as the boys become so-called assimilate or integrate as part of American society, they are deemed as the good citizen, or like I said, they're badly assimilating, right? And not becoming the good model citizen that they're supposed to be. So in some ways they're racialized as that Black underclass, as failure that could perpetuate the underclass or failure as Blackness or Black. And so in that same way, what you're saying, Khong, it has a shared experience in terms of that kind of racialization, yes, which explains why the boys talked about being policed, surveilled in the same ways as Black, brown communities in their own neighborhoods, right? In the context of being in poor, urban, rural areas that are being policed and surveilled all the time by that state-sanctioned violence, right, that we're talking about. So we have to make those connections, right? That we're not just, again, connected to the US because of our refugee experience, but we're also being measured and scrutinized and playing these parts, right? Are we the good citizens, the bad citizens, and the ways that race, sexuality, gender, class intersect at these ways to understand the Hmong American experience is very interesting, right? But they also do not get these same types of protections under the law that we would, hope if you would just play the good immigrant, did well in school, became the model minority, right? And so the boys' experience when I did my research spoke to that, right? Whether they did well or not in school, they were already being pushed into a system that was used to control and manipulate and surveil these communities of color, right? And so growing up in these spaces, the boys really didn't have that chance, correct? And so we have to think about it again as not an isolated experience. That's very much connected to these systems that tend to racialize similarly yet different, but connected in ways that benefit, one, the status quo, and two, a very elite system that is used to control and criminalize communities of color. And so that's where I think my work really tries to tease out, is that the Hmong, the policing of the Hmong boys that I studied in, an urban area in Sacramento was not an isolated event, right? And it was similar yet different from Black and brown communities of colors in which they were being policed, but it was also unique because they did have an experience of being children of immigrants, refugees, poor, unsupported by the state, and so on. So these are very interesting conversations. And even in the research and policy conversations of mass incarceration and police brutality, policing, whatever we're gonna call it, Southeast Asians are largely absent, right? The numbers aren't there. There isn't much studying or focus on that because we make a very small percentage of that conversation, right? In the prison population, in the fact that our numbers just don't exist when you compare it to Black and brown bodies. But it is concentrated enough for us to have a conversation about, right? And so I think we have to look at the ways that this is impacting our own community in ways that are similar, different, but connected to Black and brown bodies, right? And so when I was reading a lot about the Pheng killings, and then the ways the Hmong community responded, and then the injustice that their family felt because the police officer basically was acquitted and let go, right? How that was so similar, parallel the killings of the Black men and women in the communities that we're talking about right now, right? So it made sense why Pheng's mom came out immediately to say, we actually have to support the movement because this happened to my son, right? And can happen to anybody's son. So I think this is important, right? Because it brings together the fact that this person had a really real life experience connection to what had happened with the killing of a Black life. And also, we haven't talked about this yet, but what is at the heart of this issue when it concerns Hmong people and our experiences and feelings about anti-Blackness, right? Because one point that my friend brought up is we're kind of traumatized because the way that I think our community and our parents came to sort of abruptly be situated in these communities of color, particularly among poor Black people in these same neighborhoods and schools, they were traumatized by Black people, right? Through discrimination, taunting, whatever you want to call it. So this is also, to me, at the center of their resistance to fully support the movement and what's going on. So I don't know, there's a lot going on, but I think that we should not isolate ourselves, in terms of thinking that our experiences is our own, and that, I don't know how to explain it, but I think—
I pose a question to Bao, but also to the group. And that is, I'm hearing some of us say that Hmong men especially are racialized, sometimes perhaps even Black, and as if in ways similar to how Black men are racialized. I wonder if Hmong women too are Black and or racialized, or are they treated different? Are they treated similar to Black women as well? Are they hypersexualized as well? What are your thoughts on that? Do Hmong men and women receive different treatment in the society?
I think it's different because it's intersected at the category of race when that comes to play, right? Especially in my study, which suggests that boys were doing not as good as girls did, right? Especially in school comes into play. So the more girls assimilate into whiteness, it really puts them towards the model minority path, right? Where I think they have some level of protection, not from racism, but from the ways in which boys experience racism differently, right? I think girls have an experience of racism that's directly connected to being the system, right? Once they reach a certain part of like the bamboo ceiling or whatever. But I think for boys, whether they succeed or not, they're automatically put into that system even before they commit a crime. So there is this author that frames it as you're criminal in being, right? And that's exactly what Black people are, right? In their communities, in who they are criminal already. And so when Hmong boys are growing up in that particular context, they are also having that same kind of experience as being criminalized in being, right? And so this really speaks to the system that collectively puts these people in these places to criminalize them, right? Before they even become criminal. And this serves that system, right? Because it generates money, it generates power, it generates positions, it generates jobs for people to criminalize and to police the process of criminalization, correct? So that to me is really the process in which the Hmong boys get caught up growing up in these contexts. For instance, maybe if I had done a study versus, like growing up in Oak Grove versus North Del Paso Heights, there might be discrepancies. I don't know, but I would highly doubt that Oak Grove is policed the same way as it is Del Paso Heights, right? I don't know who's living in Oak Grove, but right, yeah, you grew up in Del Paso Heights. So I think there's a real, right, reality for people living there that are being policed differently.
This segment into one of our two last questions about how do we talk about Black Lives Matter with our communities. It seems there's a lot of overlap, but the issue here is that the people on the ground don't see these overlap, that they're being racialized in very particular ways. So, I want to open it up to each of you to see how do you talk about Black Lives Matter, the protests, with family members? It can get heated, very easily. And so what's your approach?
Are we doing your question now, Yang?
Yeah, and then we'll go to the next question about how do we talk about Black Lives Matter in the classroom. But because we're talking about Hmong boys' experience, I think it's a good segue to talk about how do we talk about, you know, Hmong American experiences and also related to Black Lives Matter, or, you know, we're at a time where Hmong Americans actually want to talk about race, but how
I'm
do
going
we
to post
yeah.
2 statements that my own family members made, and I refuse to get in the debate with them because it's against everything I believe in. So one statement was, one of my cousins said she didn't understand why all this nonsense madness was happening over one man's death. Second, my own brother said that if you work hard enough, you would be able to achieve the American dream. So I'm a perfect example of that. Why am I complaining, right? And so all of these issues of Black Lives Matters is a hoax, because if people just work hard enough, our civil rights and liberties are protected already. That's it. Those are the 2 statements I got. How would you respond?
Yeah,
You
so
know, it's been a difficult time for me too, because it made me, even though I realized there's immense heterogeneity, diversity within our community, it made me realize that even more. That each person, even persons in the same household or persons in the same, who grew up in the same neighborhood, may have very, very different experiences. And one of the first things we might do is make sure that we are hearing those experiences and validating those experiences. At the same time, how do we challenge views that are clearly, in my view, sexist or racist or other kind of bad things? So it's been difficult because people that I've spoken to have expressed a spectrum of views, and they have started to label these views left and right, Democratic and Republican, and Trump and no anti-Trump, or etc. So, and it's clouded the discussion even more when we put these very political loaded labels on these ideas and behaviors. I think I want to recognize that there is a tremendous diversity of views within our community. It's not necessarily bad, but it's problematic when these ideas are clearly racist or clearly sexist, clearly homophobic, clearly elitist in many ways. So I'm trying to process how we might go about so-called educating folks, informing folks, while also listening to folks' stories and listening to their experiences and saying, well, perhaps as a faculty or a professor, maybe I am privileged in ways that make me unable to see certain things within my community, despite my efforts to try to see and understand. Perhaps I don't know what really goes on a day-to-day basis in a community in which I don't live in. And so it's made me question my own experiences, my own knowledge, my own political viewpoints, my own non-political views. So I am, that is to say, frankly, still processing many of these thoughts, even though I hold firm things that I've always held firm, which is that I think Hmong care deeply about equality. And if we care deeply about equality, we ought to also care about Black Lives Matter. If we care deeply about mutual respect, or about dignity, or about humanizing other people, then we ought to care about such movement. But again, I realize people out there may have very different views because they come from very different experiences.
So for me, it's been really hard, right, to think through this. And I think, you know, that we are as faculty in a privileged place, but I think that we are not that far removed from our communities, you know, in the sense that we may have these positions, we may work for universities, but, you know, we go home to our families who live in the very same neighborhoods that, you know, either we grew up in, or, you know, that are subject to the sort of institutional inequality, right? You know, not everyone in our family has made it, if we're to think about it that way, right? So we're not that far removed from, sort of what's going on in our communities and what people, that we're closest to think and feel. I mean, I think, I'm reminded of Galia's comment when she was on a plenary panel at the AAAS conference in Madison, and she said, when people tell you their stories, believe them, right? I mean, so I believe, I mean, I know and I believe that there are anti-Blackness within Hmong communities. I mean, I also, and that comes from also, the experiences, as Bao was saying earlier, that a lot of our, parents and even, siblings, cousins experience or face interacting with, Black folks, right? And I know that, with the uprisings in Minneapolis and St. Paul in particular, that Hmong communities were hurting both for the injustice, but then also for their community, right? Whether it's their business, whether it's a family's business, whether it's the school they go to. I think that's real too. But I think that we have to turn the conversation around to say, as Bao was saying earlier, the injustices that we experience and the processes of racialization are similar, and yet different. But we have to turn the conversation around and say, well, our liberations must also be similar and linked, right? So in a sense that we are actually living and enjoying a lot of the liberties, and I mean, all the liberties that we're living and enjoying is because they were hard fought for by African Americans, right? Over 400 years, I mean, and especially post-slavery, right? And civil rights, especially. And so, the reality of the opportunities that we have, and, I also think personally, like the mentors that I've had, right, who are African American, who saw something in me and believed in me when nobody else did, right? I mean, that's also a reality, and that's turning the conversation around to say we have to think of our liberations as linked to each other. What we are able to do now, Hmong refugees and other immigrant groups coming into the U.S. and being able to work and own a business or build themselves up in however way, like that's possible because of the struggles, right, for liberation and justice and the ongoing struggle. So if we want to see the injustices that we experience as linked, we must also see that our liberations have to be linked. Otherwise, we cannot. I mean, we can try to fight for certain things that are maybe only for Hmong people. I mean, I don't know what that means, right? But that's not going to work in this, structure of white supremacy, this system of racism and inequality that, is a 400-year-old system, right? And so, I think about it in terms of, I mean, we may see, we may think that police are good and that white people can be good, right? But ultimately police are bad, right? And police also police Hmong men or Hmong communities. And so I think about then how do we talk about empathy, right? And sort of collective empathy, not empathy as like now we're talking about feelings, but empathy as a political collective empathy. And so I think about it in terms of Hmong, for Hmong folks, when someone passes away and we go to a funeral, right, to pay our respects and to remember and then to also participate, be with that family, right, as they grieve. And as Hmong people would say, you know, to like, so that they can also stay up all night, like, right? And so we go to be with them and to grieve. And when we grieve and we cry for, you know, another person who has passed, we also grieve and cry for maybe someone we have lost, right? So it's a kind of collective grieving in that way. And it's a shared sense of responsibility, right, to each other, right, that we have. And I think this is what Hmong people do that is wonderful, right? And this is how we maintain our community. This is how we sort of grow and strengthen our community. And I think that we should extend this to think about Black Lives Matter, right? And to think about racial justice. But how do we deploy this sort of sense of collective empathy and grieving so that we can help each other and be with each other, to say that George Floyd is one of our own too, right? You know, he may not look like us, but he is one of our own, in the sense that when we grieve for him, and this is why Pheng's mother's you know, speech at one of the protests was so powerful, right? Because she was grieving for George Floyd and grieving for her son, right? And I think that's the kind of political empathy that we need to have, that we already have, that we need to like extend, so that we can divest from this notion of, oh, we need to be grateful for what we have, right? We shouldn't be participating in destroying the police because the police does, or dismantling the police because it does protect us. You know, it could help us divest from, you know, furthering anti-Blackness, right? And that we can invest in political empathy. We can invest in community knowledge and care and safety and what that means. You know, Hmong people have mutual aid associations, right? Like, how do we reinvest in those kinds of things, and then look through those lenses to then also think about racial justice.
I think that one, or actually a few things come to mind about this question of teaching our communities about racial justice, about social justice, talking to our families and friends and communities about Black Lives Matter. So I mean, you know, I see the threads in various places. Even when I was organizing back, you know, in the days, you know, around like an issue like same-sex marriage, right? Where it seems so detached from the experiences of Hmong, and why should we care about that, right? And about queer justice, and about interrogating, right, the heteronormativity and the patriarchy of the state, right? And how that implicates Hmong people's oppression, right? And so I think, you know, and we had conversations. I mean, we door knocked, right? We phone banked and called Hmong people. I talked to Hmong elders. I mean, part of it is drawing shared, you know, experiences, not equivalent, right? But I think shared, right? To at least foster that solidarity, right? That Hmong, that, you know, heteronormativity actually oppresses us because we're not heteronormative in the ways in which white heteronormativity looks like, right? In states mandated heteronormativity. So, like, in that way, Hmong people got it, right? They understood, right? That, like, you know, if we redefine marriage to just be one man and one woman, Hmong people are in trouble, right? And so, like, I think having these conversations and really understanding, you know, where Hmong people come from, right? And even you know, a long time ago. I mean, now I'm going back where we're talking about Hmong people and like, you're asking the question of what's a Hmong issue, right? I mean, like I talked to elders, and this was like when I was just starting as an activist when I was in my like 15, right, and 16, where Hmong people were really concerned about like these killings of Hmong refugees or resistance fighters in the jungles, right? And like where I mean, I listened to Hmong people talk about what justice means and what justice looks like to them, and hearing these issues. So I think Hmong people have a sense of what justice looks like for their own communities, right? And I'm really sensing that activists nowadays have very little patience for listening to the elders' stories. So I think that's really important, right? To really get where they're coming from, and so that we can tease out and parse out some of the trauma, right? And to understand what justice looks like for Hmong people, right? And for issues that they care about, so that we can add on to the layers of Hmong people's experiences in the US. Another thing that made me, or another example is that, you know, the work that I did with APIs for Black Lives, you know, back in 2014 and 15, when we had the Jamar Clark murder, right, which also happened in Minneapolis, but that was actually in North Minneapolis, just 2 blocks away from my house. So we had similar demonstrations where there was a 2-week occupation of the police precinct, and that's only 2 blocks. Like I walked from my house to the occupation, right? So, you know, even then I was involved in APIs for Black Lives, and we went around. We did door knocks to talk to Asian American residents, and these are mostly Hmong American and Vietnamese American households, right? To talk about, you know, what do you think about Black Lives Matter? What are your experiences with police? Are they good or bad? If they're good, tell us why. If they're not, tell us why. You know, like I think it's a lot of patience in educating your community that I'm sensing, you know, we're running out of in this moment. But I'm also sort of hopeful because I've been seeing videos where people are translating things for our community, and how do you translate Black Lives Matter in Hmong and things like that. So I'm really seeing there is still that way of engaging our communities. But you know, we have these examples that have worked, right? Where Hmong activists, you know, and not just me, but other coalitions and colleagues and collaborators that were involved really took the time to dig into the stories of Hmong people, to foster their senses of justice, and to ask them questions. I mean, like we did door knocks where we would just ask people like, what are your hopes and dreams for your children, right? What are your visions for what you want to have in this life that you're living in America? What does it mean? And so I think there is a larger goal, right, that I have in trying to foster Hmong people's sense of social justice, but it can happen, right? And we're doing that work, but you know, it's a lot of work, and I definitely was burnt out. I was drained. I even told people I've retired, right, from that. But you know, I think it's there, and we have done it, right here in Minneapolis, right, with APIs for Black Lives, with activists working for queer justice, right? To really make it an intersectional movement, right, for Hmong to bring our elders in, you know, and it's been there, right? And I'm trying to also write about this, right, in my scholarship as well, just so that people have language to talk about Hmong people's place in America, right, especially in the social movements that's happening.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. And I think, you know, we often think that our conversations are going to change people's minds, that one conversation should be able to shift people's viewpoint. And unfortunately, that's not gonna be sufficient. And I like the fact that you bring organizing, because what's going to root out anti-Blackness in our community is, you know, consistent, ongoing efforts to really understand how our communities think about these issues. So we have to take the conversation to where they're at. I think too often, you know, whether as activists or scholars, we often have things that we're interested in. And so when we engage in this conversation, it's often based upon what we're interested in. You know, so we are interested in racial solidarity. Our community is not at that point yet. And so this past weekend was the first weekend where I actually went out because of the pandemic. You know, Hmong families are starting to host gatherings again. And, you know, people know where I stand in these positions, but I was part, you know, they're talking about it. I don't need to bring up the conversation. So I just listened. And, you know, from my observation, I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding. It's not that they're against Black Lives Matter or against defunding the police. It's that they have a very narrow understanding of these issues from a mainstream perspective. So when they think about Black Lives Matter, it is the literal translation that only Black Lives Matter. Or when they think about defund the police, they literally think that, yes, we're not going to have any law enforcement or public safety, organization. And, you know, it's much more complex than that. And I think our job is to, like my job, you know, I see my job as listen to how they're talking about these issues and then, you know, help them reinterpret or better understand, you know, these slogans that we often put out there because we take it for granted, the complexities of these slogans, what they stand for. Our communities take it at the literal translation. And so, you know, we need to be more, I would say, you know, like Pheng said, more patient and more understanding. But it depends on what the end goal is. If we're trying to fight for social justice, then we don't need our whole community to be on board. But if we're trying to root out anti-Blackness, then we do need our community to be on board with how we're seeing things. And it's going to take different approaches, different way of strategizing to really root out anti-Blackness. And I think at the end of the day, it's really about organizing. And, you know, even for Pheng, he's like, I'm not doing organizing again. So it's going to take a lot of work. Yeah.
I just want to do a quick time check. Oh, yeah. Why don't you say?
Yeah. I'm also seeing a sophisticated response by some Hmong Americans who are saying the following. So they're saying, I think what happened to Mr. Floyd is completely wrong, completely criminal. I think I understand the Black community, but what I don't get and what I don't support is all the looting and burning and the riot. Right? And I say that that's a sophisticated or semi-sophisticated response because these people are clearly saying, okay, they understand what happened, but they're not able to recognize the layers of who's doing the looting, who's rioting. They're not able to link the anger against property, against capitalist exploitation. How might we respond to such, I guess, response in our communities? And my initial thought is that I think we certainly have tremendous work to do, especially given that poverty has been is alongside racism one of the longest standing issues. And to the extent that our communities don't link poverty in our communities to capitalism, we have some work to do in making that linkage for our community. But besides that, I mean, what are your thoughts on how might we address these kinds of, let's just say, different viewpoints?
So I actually have been thinking about this a lot. So my family, we actually do have two businesses on the east side of St. Paul, which, you know, no demonstrations were held, but there were rumors, you know, that, you know, like Hmong Village was going to be burned and businesses on the east side were going to be ransacked, things like that. So there were rumors, but nothing happened. But we do have businesses on that side, and it is something that I take very seriously. You know, I understand that question, right, from Hmong Americans, and I do think that it is a legitimate question in the sense that Hmong people, you know, really want to make sense of why that tactic and what, you know, the politics of that, these particular tactics that are employed and deployed, right? So I think that we do need to let, you know, business owners, I guess, mourn, right? That I think they should certainly mourn losses if that did happen, right? Where if their businesses were burnt or windows broken, that I think mourning losses is a legitimate response. But I think the larger point I really want folks to get at is that I think grieving, right? Grieving losses is a process where we can start to let go of our attachments, right, to property, right, and capital. Because if people don't have the process to at least grieve the losses of capital, then they won't know, right? But I think what I'm really hoping is that once Hmong people get with that first step of grieving, maybe the second step would be, hey, it's not that bad, right? That my attachment to capital and to property wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, right? So it's hard, right? It's a hard place to get to, but I'm really hoping that that is possible, right? So I don't think Hmong business owners particularly have grasped that yet, but in my quest for empathizing with my own community and trying to bring them along, you know, I really want to say, go ahead, right, and be mad, but at the same time, this is the long process that you're gonna have to go through to detach your, you know, to sever, right, your attachments to capital, because capital is actually what produces the poverty that our Hmong businesses are in. And even for our businesses on the east side, you know, we're struggling even with COVID-19 and we're not getting any help, right, very much. And so we're struggling, and it's really this capitalistic system. And so I'm really hoping that more people get to that place, right, after grieving their losses, that they could say, hey, it's not bad, right? I mean, it's actually these other systems that are killing our businesses, quite literally, right?
To wrap up, I'd like to ask everyone to sort of share their takeaways from this conversation. We didn't get to talk about how we address, you know, racial injustice or talk about racial injustice in the classroom, but as you share your takeaways from this conversation, you could also highlight that as well.
I guess I'll start. I mean, I think this in this conversation is really kind of brought to light just the amount of work that needs to be done within our Hmong American communities to get to a point of racial solidarity. And I think I want to remind just everyone that, you know, the idea of race and racism, these are merely ideas. And at the root of race and racism is this white supremacy, that whites are superior to other people. And I think for a lot of us who are progressive, we often make the assumption that just because Hmong people are minorities, that they should somehow have a natural affinity for the struggles of African Americans. And the Black Lives Matter has really, you know, disrupted this assumption. And so just as race is a socially constructed idea, racial solidarity must also be cultivated. It's not just a natural feelings that minorities have for each other, because racism actually pits minorities against each other. And so we have a lot of work to do in order to build racial solidarity. And Black Lives Matter kind of exposes the rift that exists between Black communities and other minority community. And so it's important for us as scholars to, you know, help to understand where people are coming from and help provide them with an interpretation, help them reinterpret their experiences in a way that can lead to solidarity and empathy with the Black communities.
I can go next. So I really appreciated all your comments today. I learned a lot from all of you, as always. You all are really brilliant, and I'm really thankful that we shared this space together. So I really want to, I guess, say a little bit about my praxis, right, and my practice, particularly all of things that I've learned from activism and doing my research and how I employ that in the classroom, right, is that as Yang, Laura, you were saying, cultivating solidarity is a process, and that's what I teach my students is how do you ground yourself, right? What are the identities that you embody and the social positions that you come from, and whether it be white upper class, white working class, or Hmong refugee, right? That we all have a place in the project of racial, social justice and the dismantling of anti-Blackness and you know, the feminist movement and queer movement, right? So we all have a place one way or another. And I really teach that to my students to say that we have to find our place. And I've certainly found my place in all of the different movements that I've been involved in, whether it be you know, fighting for, you know, these transnational politics of Hmong in Laos, or working in the queer justice movement, or now APS for Black Lives, right? That I really had to work to position myself in these movements, and I think that's a process that we all can do. So in my class, I teach that to my students. So this is difficult work, but it's possible. And I'm actually quite optimistic whenever I teach my students, because a lot of them learn a lot, right? That they realize, hey, I can do something. I'm not just going to sit on the side. So from my praxis and practice, I've really learned that that's possible. So I want to leave it off with that as a takeaway point for this panel.
I can go next. I also really appreciate the time and opportunity to share this space with everyone here. I learned a lot from each of you. One of the things I learned in the past couple of months too, from talking to people and from our conversation here, is that people in our community want to be heard. They want to be listened to. And it's going to take a group effort to make that happen. It's probably for some of them one of the first times in their life that they've expressed a point of view or a political point of view. And it's important that we cultivate these discussions, no matter how intense some of them may end up being, no matter the disagreements we'll have. I think we can all grow and learn from these different perspectives. They're not necessarily contrasting perspectives, but they could be, but most of the time they're different perspectives. I also learned that it's important for educators, professors, teachers at every grade level to help bring some education knowledge about the context where Hmong have been before they arrive, and where other minority groups, Blacks, Native Americans, Hispanic, other Asian Americans, where they've been, so that Hmong know their position or know their location within the society and can make sense of where they are and why things are structured the way they are. So I think there's a lot more work to be done on that front to help bring context, not necessarily to expect people to agree on a single point, but I think we have certain obligations as Hmong American educators to bring accurate insights and to challenge people's false claims and to challenge that they reflect on the claims that they're making. So there's certainly a lot more work to be done. I look forward to perhaps putting together a reading list. I know we talk about this together, and bringing some resources and listing some books or articles or media that may help spark new and fruitful conversations around these topics. Tonight certainly is very rich in a number of ways, but we certainly haven't exhausted the number of important topics. So I look forward to the next conversation with other folks who are interested in having their insights and perspectives heard and listened to.
Bao, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll go and then you can close. Okay, just had a few things in my mind, which is that for us to be reminded that these issues we're seeing today are rooted in history and contemporary. So people are in pain, they're suffering because the system, what's in place isn't working, right? And it keeps repeating itself. So for us to make those connections. Second, that we've been talking about these systems of power, whether it's white supremacy, colonialism, all of the above, but to understand that they exist and connect. They exist because of these connected, interdependent relationships that we have with each other, right? Whether it's between class, gender, and all of those intersectional analyses and categories. So what's interesting is if the problems exist in those spaces, so are the solutions, right? And so one of the things I want to talk about is even the way that I'm thinking about teaching now, right? The people are hungry for change, right? The protesting, the economic crisis that we're in because of the pandemic. This is all, I think, signaling to us that change is right. People want that. So the old ways of thinking, the system is not working. And so the way that I'm approaching my classes now is to make it more solution-oriented and to approach my teaching that way. Because we tend to teach from a very chronicle way of doing, like a framing of the issue and then maybe 1 or 2 weeks of the solution, right? Actually, the way I'm going to teach now is to center that, right? To begin the conversation of what can the solution be? What can the world that we want to be and look like? And then move from there. So I think that might be a good way to start to bring people together to talk about the pain and the suffering in a way that's more healing and more, collaborative and to bring people together in the way that you're talking about the solidarity and the activism. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
I'll share my thoughts and I'll wrap up. So yes, I mean, this conversation I think is just the beginning of many more to be had. And I, definitely, as everyone has said, as part of the work is to look inward as we look outward, right? So how do we do sort of racial justice work with ourselves within our communities, but then to actually make a broader impact, right? So that it's felt, so that we support Black Lives Matter, so that we support the dismantling of the police, right? The system of policing as it exists, and state-sanctioned violence. So that is an incredible amount of work, and I think that this conversation has really brought that to the forefront, and it's something that I knew, but I think that there are so many different sectors to our community, right? Both sort of the elderly, refugee parts of a community, but also the folks who quote unquote have made it, right? Sort of, and then the folks, and then our young people. I think that that's where I feel like we can have a lot of impact, especially as educators, right? That we're in the classroom or we're working with students, and that's where we can change minds, right? And empower students to think more broadly, right? And for me, I think what's been part of the work is also healing work, right? And so the community, for me, community is huge in the sense that it is something that is fostered and cultivated growing up as a Hmong person, and being a Hmong person. But I think that is something, especially now, I feel I need, and we all need a lot, which is how do we, community helps us sort of turn and the pain and the rage and the anger at the injustice into something that we can all sort of galvanize around, right? Into something that we can then produce something else that is perhaps can be more beautiful than the pain that we're in now, right? And so I'm incredibly thankful to be and grateful to be in community with you all, to be able to talk about these issues. And I hope that we continue to build communities with each other and other folks, so that we can support each other and fight for justice. Okay, so I think that wraps up this panel, and a reading list will be accompanied with this discussion as folks are viewing it. And, you know, we are open to having more conversations. So if anyone wants to reach out, perhaps we can provide our contact information at the end of the video. And feel free to reach out to all of us or any one of us to continue to have this conversation, because that's what we are here to do.